Hello, this is Ian Williams from the Foreign Press Association of New York and the USA. And today we are venturing into orbit. Apart from the usual terrestrial concerns we have for foreign reporters, we are getting in ahead of the curve on a webinar tomorrow on the peaceful uses of outer space. This seems especially relevant. It's quite stunning to think it's half a century since the treaty on the peaceful uses of outer space, which basically followed on Yuri Gagarin and a few other people into space. It was quite early in the game that people started thinking about the legal and commercial implications. And now 50 years later, it's getting close because we've seen SpaceX, we've seen private companies going into space, we've seen whole new contenders. China has a huge space effort, which was almost unthinkable. 50 years ago, Chinese rockets were the things you let out on July the 4th. Now we have much more intensive competition in space, and one might almost say rivalry. And of course, President Trump announced Space Force about the same time that Netflix did their series on it. But more to the point is the implications here. The Treaty on Outer Space, I gather from reading the panelists' contributions, is not considered actually obsolete, but it's more of a sort of base on which we can work. It did sort of inveigh against weaponization of space. It said that people couldn't claim things. So, I gather one of the concrete examples looking through your material is if somebody lands on the moon and you don't own it, how do you stop somebody else landing on exactly the same piece of moon that you are? Or, setting up a water mining capacity next to Apollo, which the Americans feel, rightfully perhaps, they have a special right of property in, or a right of reserve. So our panelists, we have Laura Montgomery, who is a legal expert on these things and has been working on them. We have Tom Murata, who has worked with NASA and others on actual scheduling the launches, on how to reconcile them. And we have Steve Wolfe, who is a sort of, how should we say, a philosophical pioneer of these things. He's a founder of the Beyond Earth Institute and has been advocating for a broader look at humanity in space. And, at the moment, we have to get to the moon and make a permanent presence there before we can get anywhere else, seems to be the consensus. But Steve, explain the Beyond Earth Institute, how it started, and what we are talking about with tomorrow's announcements.
Yeah, thank you, Ian, and that's a great introduction. The Beyond Earth Institute is an organization that really it came about as a result of a lot of things you were just touching on. That we are at a point or cusp in the development of commercial space activities unlike we've ever seen before. I mean, 50 years ago, we were still, the computers were the size of a floor in an office building. Today you carry it around, that much power in your pocket. So we have come so far. And in this current environment with SpaceX and Blue Origin, there's more going on than ever. And what that means is, and you also touched on the fact that NASA is committed for us to go back to the moon, and with people and with boots on the ground. And beyond that, they're committing to establish a permanent, sustainable moon base. All this means is that there is going to be more and more human activity in space than ever before. And there is a continuing, and has been a continuing, interest in what does this mean eventually. It means eventually that humans will create new branches of civilization on the moon and Mars and beyond. As fantastic as that sounds, there are people who have already looking ahead. Elon Musk himself says within 20 years he wants to put a colony on the moon, on Mars. Is that whether or not that's going to occur? Human expansion into space is happening, and so what Beyond Earth is doing is is looking seriously and soberly at the policies that we need to consider and to enact in the near term, such that we can enable this future that we're talking about and encourage it to take place. And you know, that's it really in a nutshell. We're very committed to this. Tomorrow we will have an event actually on the Artemis Accords, which is a proposal by NASA to be signed by all of the international partners on the conduct of activities on and around the moon. And we're very fortunate to have Mike Gold as a guest speaker, who is the NASA Associate Administrator, who is the principal architect of those accords. So he'll come and talk to that. But then we'll further talk about how do those accords, or what do they mean in terms of permanent human expansion and development of communities beyond Earth.
And you mentioned the Artemis Accords, which are at the core of all of this. Now, that's had a mixed reception from a lot of people. Some are saying, well, yes, there's a basis, but others looking at the general record of the administration and previous behavior think it's a space grab by the United States, don't they?
The interesting thing about the Artemis Accords is that they are very much a more precise version of the principles in the outer space treaties. So, you know, there's the granddaddy outer space treaty from 1967. There's also the rescue and return agreement on astronauts, the registration convention, the liability convention, and each of those articulates a number of general principles. And so what the Artemis Accords does is it says, all right, let's act consistently with those general principles. But when we're sort of getting down to brass tacks and actually working on hardware and machinery and rockets, what do we need to make sure we're doing properly to work together? And so you see interoperability provisions in there to make sure that people's hardware is going to fit, and you won't have someone in one country building something that doesn't match up with something from another country. There's good principles about orbital debris and avoiding harmful interference, which is a big thing in the Outer Space Treaty. And you see all of these principles being laid out so that everyone can be sure they're satisfying them. So they're not really a deviation so much as an implementation of the outer space treaties.
The point about the interoperability, I suppose this is to some extent to do with rescue operations and mutual support, but it almost, wasn't it NASA who had two different stages, one on metric and one on imperial, that messed up their Mars lander? So is it too much to expect international cooperation?
That perhaps is one of those lessons learned that they're implementing here.
Inshallah, as they say in other parts of the world that need to be incorporated.
Perhaps, yes.
So what else is there to add to this in terms of, I mean, we're looking at the moon, traditional property law in times past, I mean, you own from the center of the earth up through your property line up to infinity. Obviously, the International Space Treaty sort of put a limit. Was it 100 miles or kilometers? I'm not quite sure what it was on how far you can claim territorial rights.
That's something that a lot of governments are hoping not to answer until they have to. So there is, the 100 kilometers is perhaps a popular, and it's a cultural limit, I would say. Certainly not a legal one, and not one that the United States has recognized. Instead, you have, a nation has its sovereignty over its own airspace, but not over outer space. One thing we do know is once you're in orbit, you're in outer space, but there's that whole area in between where we just haven't decided yet. So, so going beyond orbit to the moon and starting to look at, well, basically real estate development, you have a whole host of questions. One of the things that I think is a common misconception about the outer space treaties is that it prohibits private ownership. And that is not actually the case. When you look at Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, it bars national appropriation of celestial bodies and other portions of outer space. It does not bar private appropriation. There's several arguments which have counter arguments as to whether other parts of the treaties read in conjunction with that also result in barring private appropriation. But I don't know if you want me to go into all of them. But the upshot is the clear language says no national appropriation. Now, of course, even if you say, okay, national appropriation is forbidden, the United States cannot claim the moon, but what about someone who wants to go and set up shop there? Let's say Walmart wants to put a store on the moon. Is it going to invest? Is it going to put all sorts of time and effort and money into it if it thinks that someone can come along and just land on them and destroy all of their efforts? Probably not. So who would protect that is one of those questions that comes along. Well, the treaties do recognize that ownership of property doesn't change just because you put it in outer space. So perhaps governments could protect the property of their citizens, even when it's in outer space, and it is still their property. And if you're going to go and do something to it, that would be a problem for the harmful interference provision of the Outer Space Treaty, which says if you think you're going to interfere with or harm someone else, please let's talk about it first.
So Ian, if I can.
Elon Musk can set a parking lot on the moon for Teslas, and the US government can protect him. I don't think the Russians and the Chinese would quite see it that way. It would
I bet if they had someone up there, they might see it exactly that way.
If a Russian oligarch did, that would be different, obviously. Matters of
I think,
they signed the treaty, and it says, property rights don't change. If you have a piece of property like a satellite and you put it in outer space, it's still your satellite.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a concession to reality, almost unusual. Steve, you were saying?
Well, no, I think that what Laura is getting into, and she's sort of digging, a couple of layers into the details of that. I mean, that's the kind of thing that Beyond Earth wants to get into. Property rights is going to be a very important issue as we, as private individuals, are building facilities, whether it's to access resources in the solar system. But there are so many other issues. What is the government's role in all of this? I mean, is the government going to be the folks who are going to help to build the infrastructure in space? So we know that we have the highway system. We have a highway system that's an infrastructure. Government plays a huge role in that. Is the government going to play a role in infrastructure, getting people to where we want to go to? How do we finance the macro structure construction in space? So we're talking about right now. We're putting up small modules like on the International Space Station. But when you start talking about macro structures, the whole game starts to change, and all sorts of new thinking has to go into it. But I definitely want to give Tom an opportunity to share this report that we've put together, which is part of the cornerstone of launching Beyond Earth. So, if that's okay, Ian.
Yes, please.
Yeah.
Tom, the floor for a little bit.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Ian, for inviting us here today. So last month, the Beyond Earth Institute, which I'm a part of, we published a paper called Policy Recommendations to Accelerate the Establishment of Communities in Space. And it's available on our website, beyondearth.org. And in the course of doing that report, we interviewed 7 space policy thought leaders, and we extracted a number of recommendations from those interviews. Just going to summarize them very quickly here, and perhaps that can generate some more conversations, more thoughts. The first recommendation that's coming out is the US government must revamp its arms and its export control regime in order to facilitate more cooperation and cross-border investment. Currently in the US, it's very challenging for a US aerospace company to cooperate and collaborate with companies outside of the US. Beyond Earth Institute thinks that should change in order to facilitate more thinking, more exchange of ideas, and more exchange of money, frankly, inside and outside of the United States to facilitate communities in space. The second recommendation has to deal with not waiting for the government to create laws and regulations to enable this future we're talking about. So we think the international aerospace industry can work together to create voluntary norms of behavior to facilitate this expansion that we're talking about. And we see precedents in other industries. For instance, the film industry has the Motion Picture Association of America, and they create standards without any government involvement to help facilitate investment and make the industry work better. And finally, the third recommendation is the US government should take a leadership role to create some sort of multilateral agreement, perhaps another treaty, to encourage more commercial development in space with the long-term goal of establishing a permanent human presence in outer space, communities in space. And we feel that actually the Artemis Accords, which we'll be discussing tomorrow in our webinar tomorrow at 1, with Mike Gold, the Artemis Accords might be a beginning of that exact process. So it's just a coincidence that the recommendation came out about the same time as the Artemis Accords, but it shows that we're really hitting the zeitgeist. We're right on the cutting edge there.
But we're blessed, cursed. We have an administration that seems to be set against almost every form of international treaty or regulation. It's pulling out of lots of existing international organizations, not to mention the WHO, thinking of terrestrial affairs. It's pulling out of arms limitations treaties. Are there any signs that the White House is prepared to consider, and yes, he set up the Space Force, but is he prepared to go further into orbit and consider further international organizations, or does he think this is some derogation of American sovereignty?
Well, historically, the U.S. has not been in favor of changing the existing treaties or entering into new ones in space. Instead, it has been taking the approach of let's set up guidance, more soft law, than on an international level. So I don't think it marks too much of a change, between administrations to see this lack of interest in some sort of international organization. However, I would suggest that the Artemis Accords themselves and the desire for international partners with the Artemis missions are a sign that the United States does want to pursue international cooperation in such a very big venture as returning to the moon with a human presence there.
I'm thinking that, space exploration and establishing commercial development in space, it's very expensive and very complex. And as Laura mentioned, returning to the moon, the Artemis Accords is a clear sign that the Trump administration wants and needs international cooperation to have a sustainable, enduring, permanent presence in space. The Beyond Earth Institute is very clear that what we're doing, the policies that we're investigating, are for all humanity, not just the United States.
I was thinking back on a UN mode of the International Seabed Mining Authority, which is still not exactly rapturously picked up by Washington, even though other countries were involved. And there also was a dog in the manger attitude. A lot of countries that said, well, if we can't do it, neither can you, was the attitude of some of the members. But is it going to meet the same type of problems? If you're going to mine the moon, who gets the royalties?
Well, the U.S. did pass a law. Oh, sorry, Steve.
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. The U.S. passed a law in 2015 recognizing that if you are someone who extracts resources from outer space, helium-3, platinum group minerals, just plain old lunar regolith for building something, then you are the owner of that, much as a fisherman taking fishes from the sea is the owner of the fishes he's caught. So that 2015 law clarified quite a bit that the U.S. recognizes, title in those extracted resources.
Right, and we want these, these activities are going to be occurring. We're going to be accessing the asteroids and lunar. I mean, there's water on the poles, the southern pole of the moon, and that's a tremendous resource. And we want to remove whatever barriers that there may be in accessing those. I mean, the United States is obviously taking a unilateral position, but we certainly want to have a multilateral agreement in these changes, because as we move out, as the amount of activity increases, leading ultimately to permanent communities in space, we have to sort these issues out, hopefully to the satisfaction of the entire international community. And I think the Artemis Accords will be an interesting test case. I think that they have been. I think there was some initial some initial negative comments before they were released, and I think after they were released, I think for the most part, the international space partners have been very positive about that. So we're encouraged to see this unfold, and and Beyond Earth would be part of that discussion.
Well, have you anticipated the what in terrestrial terms again we regarded as the tragedy of the commons? Mm-hmm. If it's a finite stock, if there's one mine of water on the moon and somebody gets it and glugs it all down, what can you do to ensure that it's preserved for posterity for longer term use, and you don't just get Coca-Cola company going up and bottling there and using it all?
No, and I think that's where effective policy comes in. We like to use the term sustainable. So if there is the one company that goes in and somehow manages to dominate that becomes an unsustainable long-term arrangement that's benefiting a single entity. We would see a future where resources could be shared so that we can maximize the participation by individuals and companies of all kinds to take advantage of these resources. But those are the kind of challenges that we have to confront. And if we're not confronting them, then you're right, we create a Wild West scenario where the first person there gets all the gold, and we really can't have that either, right?
And I think that one of the solutions that the Institute will be looking at is whether private property can help avoid the tragedy of the commons. I mean, that's my own perspective, and these are early days in the Institute's history. So as one of the advisors, I'm not speaking for the Institute, but I do think that, private ownership goes a long way towards husbanding resources that, you see a lot of problems with the oceans being treated as a commons, with the pollution, the mountains of plastic, the extinction of species, where no one has an investment in making sure that the resources stay there and last. Instead, everyone tries to grab their own. So one of the things that we'll have to be looking at is whether private property can be a solution, especially on a celestial body. It's a little harder in what some scholars call void space, orbit, where you maybe do have to start figuring out a more communal response or set of solutions. But there's lots of options in the policy toolbox to choose from.
Well, one of the things that springs to mind, a scarce resource, is the geosynchronous satellite slots. Is there any international sort of agreement on how these should be allocated?
Oh, yes.
I know that countries like Tuvalu, of all people, they claimed a fairly significant proportion of the slots, more than their microscopic size justified, and they compromised in the end. But how do you allocate these, and how do you avoid squabbles about it?
There is an international agreement and a body, the International Telecommunications Union, which does actually, it's a gathering of nation states with interests on orbit, and they allocate out the slots between countries. They come to consensus agreements as to, who can get what.
But Ian, you hit on some great points that, the way geosynchronous satellites are organized and the way they're parceled out, so to speak, there was a lot of thought and work and effort put into creating that policy framework, which does not exist for a lot of the concepts that are being proposed by commercial developments today, commercial industry today. And so that's what the Beyond Earth Institute is trying to, that's the gap we're trying to fill, so to speak, in order to prevent the sort of challenges that you bring up already. So.
Right. And it's interesting, Ian, you talk about satellites, and those are robotic equipment. When you add humans to the equation, it gets much, much more complicated. There's still folks will tell us right away, from NASA, that there's so many questions, especially just on the physiological side of things. We don't know about the long-term effect of radiation and what kind of proper shielding would be necessary to protect humans that are living on the moon or in other parts of the solar system. We don't know about the effect on bone density for long duration and weightlessness. We know that it's bad, but how do we compensate for that properly? If the moon is 1/6 gravity of Earth, well, you could still walk around or hop around like the Apollo astronauts did, but what is the long-term effect of such a low gravity? So there's physiological questions that need to be resolved. There are other technical issues, for example, how do we use the resources in space as construction materials, right? So we want to essentially live off the land eventually. So we can't if we're going to build a home on the moon, we don't want to bring the whole house with us, right? We want to bring the tools with us that will allow us to use the materials on the moon to construct the large-scale habitats. So you're talking about certain complexities where we don't want NASA engineers. We're probably more interested in a construction company like Halliburton or Skanska, who can help us to understand, complex construction projects. So, that's the kind of thinking that we want to try to bring to this conversation about human development in space.
Well, one of the purposes, as you put in the paper, is you need a serious legal framework before you can attract investment. Governments invest in space for other reasons than making a cash return. But investors do expect dividends, and they want to know that their income is secure, that their property rights are secure, that they can mortgage their homestead on the moon if they need to raise capital. How is this feasible? Are there the financial structures? I understand that it's an echo of the old British movie, The Mouse That Roared, that Luxembourg has shown an interest in being a broker in these affairs. Does that work into your legal framework?
Yeah. Tom, you want to take that?
Well, we have Laura as our lawyer, our attorney, but I will just mention that one of the subject matter experts we interviewed for the paper, Pete Warden, will also be on our webinar tomorrow, and he is an expert in working with many international players, foreign countries, including Luxembourg. And so suffice to say, the answer to your question is, in my opinion, yes, there needs to be more international efforts, but I would defer to Laura on the exact legal interpretation.
well, it's great to be deferred to.
They
But
landed the meteorites out in Europe.
I always let my lawyer do the talking.
Well, on the legal question of property rights, outside of the United States, Luxembourg, as you know, you mentioned, has recognized property rights in extracted resources. So I think other countries are starting to think like that, and legal scholars are coming around even as to the existence of property rights in extracted resources. However, you know, in land, that's another question. And I think that's something that will have to be addressed for your investors, Ian, to feel confident that they can go forth and spend a lot of money in building something and then not have it taken away from them. One legal framework that I'm rather fond of personally is the rules of adverse possession, or squatters' rights in plain language. But that is an, you know, common law doctrine that goes back hundreds of years, where if you have appropriated land, even if it's your neighbor's, and you're there for a very long time and you use it and everyone knows about it and no one contests your use of it, eventually, after some set period of time in the United States, that's different between states, it becomes yours. If you're doing it secretly, it doesn't become yours, because, you know, the true owner didn't have a chance to say, "Hey, get off my land," because they didn't know you were burrowing underneath their cabbage patch. But these principles of adverse possession are well tested. You know, they've withstood the test of time, and could perhaps be applied to people going into outer space. And if they are able to, you know, build something and stay there and use it and have a continuous presence, maybe over time we could say, all right, you've been there 10 years, it's super hard and really expensive, you must mean it. We will recognize your title in that piece of land.
Mm-hmm.
Simon Locke's got an interesting question that follows to this to some extent. As well as ownership, there's a question of, obviously there's a tort lawyer in the house. What are the principles around liability? If a Chinese rover crashed into the US space station on the moon, for example, who is liable? Who sues whom? And
well,
where?
It's, there are different standards of care. I am not a tort lawyer, but there is the 1974 Liability Convention, which addresses this very question. I would have to go read it more carefully to answer his question properly, but it does lay out that launching states can be absolutely liable and or fault-based liable, depending on whether the damage takes place on the ground on Earth or in outer space. And so you could go through a very similar process as you go through here to figure out liability on the moon if, let's say, a Chinese government rover crashes into a US government rover. And everyone's going to say it was the other guy's fault. And just like on Earth, you might wind up in court or you might settle trying to figure it out.
This is going to be the mother of all jurisdiction shopping, though, isn't it?
It could be.
Ian, I'd like to take a moment and discuss,
Sure.
I don't think we've hit on yet why we, humanity, ought to establish permanent human communities in space. Why should people live in space? And I'd like to take a crack at it and then give Steve and Laura a chance to expound on it as well. But in my opinion, you know, people should go live in space not only because it's cool and interesting, but most importantly, to benefit everyone else who lives back here on Earth. I mean, only a very, very small portion of people will ever go into space, and we're all still living back here. Well, why should we build a policy framework to encourage those people to go out? Because those people will unlock vast, mind-boggling amounts of raw materials, energy. They'll create new intellectual property that will then benefit and improve life on Earth. Jeff Bezos himself, who owns and funds a space company, it's a big space enthusiast. He said, you know, we should protect the Earth. We only have one. It is our unique homeland, and we should, you know, we could see a future many years in the future where industry is in space and the Earth is like a park, and all the pollution and all the industry is out in space, and we're protecting our biosphere. This is part of the vision that the Beyond Earth Institute has. You know, it's very long term, that would be decades, if not centuries away, but we need to start now with a policy framework to enable those people to go out there to then benefit all of us back here on Earth.
But doesn't space need some protection as well? I immediately start thinking of spoiled tips on the moon, and tailings building up, tailings dams building up on Mars, on the deserts. Again,
sounds like a great policy challenge for the Beyond Earth Institute. I mean, I'm being.
Feel free. I challenge you.
You're absolutely right. We need to prevent that pollution on Earth, and we need to make sure that industry on the moon is done in a sustainable manner, so it can work for centuries to come.
Brett Jones has asked, how do we preserve and honor the monuments like the first steps on the moon and other future exploratory milestones as we continue to explore? These sound like candidates for World Heritage Sites. Can we just extend the UNESCO agreement? Oh, the US has just withdrawn from UNESCO as well. Can we extend the UNESCO agreements to outer space?
Mm-hmm. Laura, is that, are you part of the Heritage, or is that Michelle?
That's Michelle Hanlon.
Oh, Michelle Hanlon. Yeah, so another one of our advisors, Michelle Hanlon, who's with University of Mississippi, actually runs an organization that is trying to do just that, preserve the cultural heritage of the Apollo sites on the moon, so that they could be maintained for future generations. A very extremely worthy project that we would obviously want to support. You know, there's, when you talk about the resources of the solar system, as Tom was alluding to, and you compare those to even the resources of the entire planet Earth, you know, they are just boundless. And so the idea, that there will be certainly, you'd have an opportunity to sort of protect whatever you wanted to protect, and to preserve, even on the moon, preserve sections of the moon, like on Earth, you preserve sections just in their pristine nature for future generations. The potential, it's really about the potential once you're up there, once you have a strong foothold, and humankind, along with their robot helpers, are up there. They're just, the potential is really just boundless, and we just want to help to unlock that enormous potential for as Tom says, for the benefit of all mankind.
And I'll add, Ian, regarding your question about the heritage sites, the Artemis Accords, the new NASA policy that we mentioned earlier, does include a clause about protecting heritage sites on the moon. So if a partner nation goes to the moon with NASA, then one of the things they have to agree to is protecting heritage sites on the moon. So it's part of the Artemis Accords.
If they partner with NASA, yeah. But if the Chinese go independently and say, let us discreetly go there with a broom and brush out the dust and show that the Americans were never there, really, what can you do about it?
Yeah, that's one of the unfortunate things. Maybe Laura, you could comment. We have China has decided to go its own way with respect to developing space and developing their space program. I would hope that over time we could work cooperatively with them and collaboratively, so that we can, preserve these sites, and they would recognize that. But right now, that we are two separate programs that don't interact.
Laura, are you?
Yes, there is actually U.S. legislation that puts restrictions on NASA cooperating with the Chinese in the various space programs. So, that's it's a two-way street there, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
It's because the strange thing about this is, of all the countries, reading the Chinese literature, the sort of the expansive science fiction and the novels, and they're thinking about it, that this is one place on the world where there's a huge constituency, a popular constituency behind space exploration.
Mm-hmm. Oh, certainly. But you know what's happening? I mean, as part of the this sort of growth, massive growth and interest in space that's taking place right now, you're seeing many nations that were not spacefaring before suddenly being very interested. I was just on a call today with Ecuador. Ecuador is creating their own spaceport. You know, they want to be launching. They have the contract to launch from there. Another.
The name. They're on the equator. Great for orbital
location. So one of our team members in the Beyond Earth is actually studying in New Zealand right now, and that's where, you know, they're at least attempting to shoot rockets from New Zealand. You know, so part of this whole explosion of activity is that all these new spacefaring nations are starting to join the fray. Luxembourg is an obvious one. And in some ways, these small countries like Luxembourg have a leg up on big economies like the U.S. and Russia, in that they can be more flexible. They can their laws, you know, it's an easier place for entrepreneurs to work, and that's how they've been able to develop their activities over the last 5 years or so, and then how they continue to plan to go forward. So there's a lot of activity. It's not just the U.S. and the Russians anymore. You know, South America, Africa, just every continent is getting into the game. So that's what's really exciting about all this.
Japan?
Japan? Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yeah. For decades now.
Yes.
Huge. They have been for some time. They're part of the International Space Station. They have their own module on the International Space Station, and they have their and they just launched a spaceport, the commercial spaceport that they'll be launching out of, and they have their own rockets program and so forth. So,
is there anywhere else that we don't
visited asteroids?
Yeah,
of course, yes.
Japan has had an asteroid mission, so.
What all this is, and I keep coming back to this point about what's the point of Beyond Earth. You know, there are many space policy organizations out there that are trying to look at what are the cutting edge issues in space that have to be addressed, and space lawyers and so forth get together and try to inform and advise Congress so that we can kind of get to the next year, get to the next decade. And we are clearly staking this claim, if you will, that we want to focus on those policies that look even further down the road. How do we advance through policy, advance this idea of creating sustainable communities beyond Earth? It's an interesting and challenging kind of question that we're asking, and we're hoping that folks will agree with us that this is an interesting area of involvement. We do want to have the issue or the topic of creating communities beyond Earth we want to add that onto the agenda of space policy boards and advisory boards of all kinds in Washington and in the international community. Is not too early. We actually say we're behind schedule. We're kind of playing catch up with all the real activity that's going on right now. So we're excited about it. Tomorrow we're going to get into it a little bit more. I will make another plug for Pete Worden that Tom mentioned. Pete Worden is also an advisor for Beyond Earth. He is the former director of NASA Ames Research Center. He was for many years, so he's got some incredible chops, and now, of course, he's been working, spends about half the year, he tells me, in Luxembourg and advising that government. So we are an international community. We have to work in this together, and it's not too early to ask these big questions.
How easy is to get political buy-in? One of my many years ago, I did research into the British Interplanetary Society, one of whose founders was Arthur C. Clarke, the inventor of geosynchronous satellites. And I was looking through their archives, and they sent a letter to the British War Ministry in 1939, suggesting that they might be interested in rockets. And the Ministry of Defense, the War Ministry, then they're a bit more open, said, we don't see anything feasible there. This was about 2 years before the V2 started hitting them. So you have to get past political short-sightedness with these things quite often. How much of this are you meeting?
Well, I mean, I think that we're gonna face. I'm sure we'll face quite a bit of it. I mean, we're stepping into this for the long haul. You know, I have to say that we've got over 150 people registered for our program tomorrow. Very few of those I would classify as your regular space enthusiast. We have the international space agencies are represented. Certainly NASA is heavily represented. Industry is represented. So I do see the potential. I do see the potential for the various stakeholders to be willing to come together and ask and engage in this question, right? Policies aren't.
Also, I would add that
Go ahead.
and it helps very much that there are a number of very well-funded billionaires with space companies talking about building, permanent human communities beyond Earth. And not only do they have the money, but they're starting to have the track record. SpaceX has a fantastic track record. So when the founder of SpaceX, Elon Musk, says, I want to build a city on Mars, people sit up and listen, because 10 years ago when he said, I'm going to build reusable rockets, nobody believed him, but he did it. And so Jeff Bezos as well, richest person in the world, wants to have millions of people living and working in space. Richard Branson, another billionaire, is very interested in space. There are many, many other very accomplished, well-funded people pursuing this idea. And so that wasn't the case not so long ago, but now it is. So there's a lot more credibility to the idea than there once was.
Well, one of the questions that's come in that covers this to some extent. How can you make sure that the organizations are not controlled by the funders? You've got a lot of monstrous egos, huge egos out there, the billionaires, who obviously have strong opinions about everything from charter schools to whether people should work during COVID epidemic. Can we trust them to help shape the policy for humanity in space?
You make it sound like we shouldn't, but I'll take the other side here and suggest that the people who are doing the work, who are putting their money at risk, who are actually going forward with all this, they might know more than the rest of us. The government employees, and I was one honorably for over 2 decades, don't know as much as the people on the ground. So I think that we should be very careful before we start making rules for them. We should first find out what they're doing and what they think. It's got to be a collaborative effort going forward. And I don't think the fact that someone wants to make money is a reason all on its own to mistrust them. The fact that they want to make money by going into space, that makes them awesome.
Mm-hmm. I couldn't have said it better.
Yeah, and to Simon's question, how do you avoid having an organization being controlled by one entity, whether they have money or not? The answer is to invite as many voices as possible into the organization. And Beyond Earth Institute has done that, and we continue to do that. And we hope to have even more voices and more people involved with us, both those with money and those without.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a space lobby in Washington?
We're not.
If not, why not?
That's down the road. No, right now we consider ourselves a think tank in that we are a research organization. We are digging deep into the issues. We're bringing together the talent and the expertise together to dig into difficult questions like property rights and other things. And so we say that we're not an advocacy group or a lobbying group. We want to leave that to other groups. There are other advocacy groups that are and that are doing some very, very good work. and we encourage. And so what we would do is encourage them to take advantage of our research and our recommendations, so that they can then take them and incorporate them into their legislative strategy. That's not to say, though, that we won't be working closely with Capitol Hill, working closely with UN organizations, working closely with people, different policymakers in the various relevant space agencies. So, but we're just not, we want to be the source for the best information and the best recommendations, and then let others carry the banner, if you will, to insist that Congress change the laws.
Well, I think we're getting towards the end here. Is there any of you want to say something stirring to direct our attention to extraterrestrial space, ever onwards and upwards, Parado, Ad Astra, or whatever?
Well, I would just say that I encourage everyone to, if you have not already registered for the web program tomorrow with Mike Gold from NASA, Associate Administrator, who's heading up the Artemis Accords, and Pete Warden, I would go to beyondearth.org, and you'll see the link right on the homepage to sign up, and on how to sign up for that event, which is 1 to 2:30 Eastern time tomorrow, and hopefully you could join us. Mm-hmm. I'll defer to the other folks for any closing comments. Tom?
I just want to say thank you to the Foreign Press Association and to Ian for having us. And yeah, I look forward to seeing everybody tomorrow at our 1 p.m. webinar.
Laura, do you want to add a legal caution? Any small print?
The fine print. No, I'll just say thank you very much, Ian. I really appreciate being included in the discussion today.
Yeah, I'll add my thanks, Ian, and this is a great opportunity. Beyond Earth, we're very fortunate to have an incredible team, including Tom and Laura. And if you look at our team page and our advisor page on the website, you'll be impressed as well. And look forward to anyone who's interested in this conversation to be in touch with us. There's a lot of work to do. Thanks again, Ian.
Thank you, all of you. This is Ian Williams, the president of the Foreign Press Association, and it's really invigorating to be dealing with an issue where all human life is there. Something for legal correspondence, financial correspondence, science correspondence, avionics correspondence. I think we can, there's something here for everybody to run off and get a story with. So I hope that you all look into it, go to the webinar tomorrow and get into more detail if it's there, and get in touch if you want more details. And as a lifelong science fiction, I mean, I think we're living through a dystopia at the moment compared with my other science fiction, but I like the old science fiction when we get into space with rockets roaring and helmets on. So it's good to revert to that form of futuristic thinking. Thank you very much, everybody. Please follow our website, follow our site, join the Foreign Press Association if you're eligible. And we have many more interesting seminars and press conferences to come. Thank you very much, everybody.